In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here yet again, week after week, out of the, Chris, how did you used to call it? The best international apologetics.
Number one international apologetics podcast being broadcast from West Chicago.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The number one international apologetics broadcast out of West Chicago, Illinois. We are the only one, for those that are ever wondering.
That's not a confirmed metric, but we are confirmed
that's true.
to be
That's,
number one.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like world's best coffee.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, we've got it. All right. Well, if you're just joining us on last week's episode, we had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. J.P. Moreland, and we talked about scientism and secularism, his recent book that's coming out very soon in October. And if you haven't had a chance, we've got that up at our website, and you can pre-order the book. We've got a link there to Amazon. We would love for you to check that out. On today's program, we're talking about cold case Christianity. But before we get to that, I've got one announcement for an event that we've been planning for the ages. The Defenders Conference 2018, Genocide in Scripture. We hope you'll join us next week at the Christian Church of Clarendon Hills, here in the western suburbs of Chicago. We have 4 different Christian perspectives on the supposed genocide commands. And this is going to be a great opportunity for you to come and learn about these perspectives, to be prepared for when an atheist or a skeptic might ask you, hey, doesn't Yahweh instruct the Israelites to kill even the women and the children? How are we to respond to that? So we've got this great opportunity to learn about these different views, and I'm sure the panel discussion is going to be just a fascinating opportunity to hear these scholars interact with each other's views. Of course, there will be breakout sessions as well for different topics. You can learn more all about this and register even online at thedefendersconference.com. Again, that's September 28 and 29, next week. We would love to see you there. We even have a group of 6 high school teachers coming from Louisville, Kentucky. We have a couple from Virginia, a family from Oklahoma. So people from all across the country are coming just for this event, which is so great. I hope it will be a huge blessing to them. All right, on today's program, we're talking about cold case Christianity. Well, what does that mean? Our guest on today's program is J. Warner Wallace, or Jim, as his friends call him. He is a cold case detective, a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and a professor of apologetics at Biola University, my alma mater. He's the author of several books, which I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about. Jim, thanks so much for joining us on our program today.
Hey, really glad to be with you, but I'm looking at, I was cheating while you were introducing all this, and I was looking at your Defenders Conference.
Yep.
Wow, you got a great lineup. I mean, if people, if they're watching or listening to this, because I'm just looking, I know who all these guys are, and I know what their positions are on this, and you have really done a good job, I think, at picking the 4 people who best represent the variety of Christian views on this topic. So really, congratulations. That's going to be a good conference. I think that'd be a lot of fun to where am I next week? Anyway, I'm actually in Ohio and in Tennessee. Dang it. But this is a good conference to go to. So if anyone's interested, these are the guys who have written the most extensively, have published the most extensively, and are probably the foremost authorities in this area. So I can't imagine coming away from that conference and not having that issue settled in your own mind. So that's great. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's going to be a blast. And if for whatever reason your flights get canceled, come on out to Chicago.
Right? I just need to cancel an event so I can get to this. That's the bad thing sometimes about being a speaker and doing events, is that you find yourself, even for like church, people will say, well, what church is your, well, I've got a church that I tithe at, but I'm never there because on Sundays I'm always in somebody else's church speaking. It's a challenge. This is true also for conferences. It's like, you don't get to even the ones that are local that I could go to, I'm probably traveling. So you're right. It makes it hard.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. All right, Jim. So for those of you who don't know you, you are a cold case detective for a number of decades now.
Yep.
And you have integrated the skills that you've learned as a cold case detective to come to the Christian faith. So, you were raised as an atheist, which is
Yep.
not many people are raised atheists. I guess more people are today. But
maybe, yeah. And it wasn't so much that I was even that like my family was like, okay, we're going to make sure that this guy doesn't believe anything.
It's just that religion wasn't a big thing.
Right. There was just nobody who was a believer to do otherwise. So you just are raised in this environment where you just, didn't go to church, didn't know anybody who did go to church, didn't know anybody who believed this was true. And everyone I did meet along the way in my life who would tell me they were Christians didn't seem like they were able to. They didn't seem like they came to it for very good reasons. And even when you would push back a little bit, they would really not. They'd kind of shrink from your pushback. And so I just thought, okay, this is like people who like certain kinds of food. I don't like those kinds of food, so I'm not going to be eating with them, that kind of a thing. So that's just kind of where I left it for a number of years. Although I would tell you, I used to mock, and I can remember one of my partners. I don't want to give him away because you wouldn't know if I was talking about him, but we were working undercover when I became a Christian. About a year before I did, I remember we had a guy in our team. No, I'll tell you what it was. We had a guy we arrested who was an outspoken Christian and told us that he was a Christian as we were taking him to jail after watching him do a bank robbery. We were a surveillance team. We watched guys just do robberies. And so we thought we had a guy that was doing bank robberies. We got up on him. We spent maybe a week with him, watched him score dope, watched him live his life. He ran out of money, and he walks into a bank, and he does a bank robbery of a home savings here in Lakewood, California. And after we're done, we chase him down because he kind of then got nervous and started looking over his shoulder, and he spotted our team. And so now we're in a pursuit. And so we're in playing cars. So we're chasing this guy in playing cars, which is stupid. But we ended up, crashing his car and taking him to jail. And he's on the back of my car on the way to and he told me that he said, I really should know better than this because, my wife and I were Christians. We became Christians at a large outdoor evangelistic event, and he knows better, he had said, And so I remember sharing the story with one of my partners, and we just, mocked this poor guy mercilessly because we thought this is what Christians do, right? They doesn't seem like they have makes any difference in their life, and how can you hold these views yet still be doing bank robberies? And we thought, as atheists, we seem to behave a lot better, than these Christians were taken to jail, and that was something that always stuck in my head. And then, sure enough, a year later, I'm investigating Christianity, and all my partners are mocking me for even taking the step of investigating anything, right? Let alone I wasn't even there yet, but I was just investigating it to see if it was true. And that went on for probably another 5 or 6 years as they mocked me as a new Christian. But yeah, so a lot of it for me was just not raised in an environment where I had any positive examples of thoughtful, reasonable, evidential Christians that would kind of guide me toward this,
So what was it in your experience that sort of brought you to the belief that there is a God?
Well, okay, so a lot of it was just that Susie, my wife, was more interested and had been raised kind of as a cultural Catholic, and had a mom who's a believer, and was really a Bible reader, somebody who understood the claims of Christianity. But Susie was more of a cultural experience kind of a person who, after we would been together about 18 years, and during that 18 years, I don't think I'd ever been to church for anything other than like a performance, someone's performance, or a wedding or a funeral or something like that. I mean, I was really I was not interested. But if Susie was interested, I would go. I'd be happy to go. Only because I want to do. My dad's the same way, by the way, as a non-believer. He'd be happy to go with his family members. When I was a pastor, he came to our church, and he's happy to sing the hymns. He thinks that Christianity has a place in culture, an important place in culture that needs to be upheld. But he thinks it's not true, but it does provide great structure and moral foundations. Yeah, so he was willing to that was my position too. And so it was her encouragement to go. I finally went with her. We were in this neighborhood about 3 years, living in this house, and I finally just said, okay, I'll go. And I went, and the pastor was just so gifted. And that's why a lot of things are said about, the way that pastors work in culture, right? And I know that there's all a variety of churches that are out there, and I get it why people would argue for one form of church over another. But I kind of think every form of church has got value and it's got liabilities. And we just need to get over the fact that we see these liabilities, we want to nitpick. Because I was in a church at that point that was really a seeker-sensitive church that I would say today, I'm not sure that's really the approach I would take. Well, really, that's the approach that reached me, because this guy was able to throw the ball across the center of the plate in a way that I could hit it. And he pitched Jesus as a smart, wise sage whose moral teaching in just a couple of important sermons changed the foundation of Western civilization. He actually provoked me to think about whether or not I was in fact enforcing laws that were grounded in the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And I thought, is that true? And so it provoked me to buy a Bible. And that's when this all began. So that's really how I got interested. And, it wasn't because we were in a position of crisis, or it just was honestly just a pastor who provoked me to examine these claims. And the only way you can examine the claims is to read the text. And then you have to figure out whether this text is reliable or not. And that's what I started to do over the next 6 months.
So for you then, perhaps going from atheism to Christian theism was sort of one step. For some folks, they can come to belief in God, and then they realize,
Right.
oh, Christianity is the best reflection of everything else I see. But for you, it's kind of a two-package deal.
Well, here's what happened for me. It kind of was, but what really happened for me is kind of traced in my books, and it came in the order of my books. So I became convinced that the Gospels contained reliable eyewitness accounts. And then, of course, you got a problem. And I would have said, well, they're reliable up to miraculous stuff. So I would have excised all of that. That was my first step of kind of trusting, right? Okay, I get that to the extent you can verify ancient claims, I really felt comfortable with these claims because I had a process in place. Remember, when you're working cold case homicides, you're working any crime, you're working an event in the past. So as a detective, if I get a report on my desk, that thing's probably 2 days old. Before it went through all of our processing and I finally get the report, it's probably 2 days old. If I open a cold case, these are just homicides because there's no statute of limitations on a homicide. If I decide to open one of those, well, now this is really cold. This is it happened maybe 35 years ago. And I may not have access to my witnesses anymore. They might be dead. Many times they are. And a lot of times too, I've got a report written by a detective, and when I call that guy, he's either so old that he can't really help me anymore, or he's dead too. So because maybe he was 35 or maybe 40 when he wrote the report, and cops don't live that long. We all die in our 50s. So I'm like, okay, now I'm stuck with a report about something, and I have no access to the eyewitness they're talking about, and I have no access to the person who wrote the report to tell me about an eyewitness who's now dead also. So it's very similar to what we're looking at here. And so I got to that point where I felt, okay, I'm testing these, but I still cannot take that step because I'm such a committed philosophical naturalist that I rejected anything miraculous in the Gospels. And that's when I had to do a timeout and say, okay, what am I grounding? Why do I believe that miracles are out of bound? Why do I believe? I need to test this and see if, as an atheist, I already held some extra natural beliefs related to cause. And I just needed to check that. And so the second book I wrote, God's Crime Scene, really talks about that time out where I said, okay, let's take a look and examine whether or not naturalism can really explain the universe the way it is. If it can't, if the best explanation for the universe is a personal divine being that is the first uncaused cause of all space, time, and matter, well, then I really need to surrender my hesitancy about miracles, because to create everything from nothing, that's a pretty big deal. And then anything else I would see in the New Testament would be small potatoes by comparison. So that's where I then relinquished my hesitancy about miracles, because I do think that the best explanation for the universe is an all-powerful, non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material first cause that is the grounding for all moral things we consider to be virtuous, and is the basis for information in DNA, the design we see in both the fine-tuning of the universe and in biology, and also is the reason why we experience mind and we have free agency, because we have been designed in the image of a being that is a mind that freely creates. Once I got to that point, then I was open to the claims of the Gospels, and then I became a Christian. Now, look, that process was not just me working hard to kind of figure through. It's just I had a bunch of barriers that I had constructed in front of the gospel that stood between me and the cross, and I needed to knock those down. And my interest to begin with in knocking those down didn't start for me until I was 35, and I truly believe that was God working, because you cannot reason your way to the cross. God's going to call you, but he may use the evidence. And I think he's been doing that for 2,000 years, now a lot of us have grown up in a tradition where we didn't come to faith through the evidence. But I don't think that's part, if you see the biblical model in the book of Acts, it is always on the basis of direct evidence. That's the eyewitness testimony of people who saw the resurrected Christ. That is the catalyst for all belief in the book of Acts. It's never like, have you ever stolen anything? Then you're a thief. Have you ever lied? Well, then you're a liar. You need to sell. No, it's not about that. It's not about the kind of way of the master approach to evangelism.
Yeah.
It's not about big stadium evangelism. It's this. The Old Testament folks predicted these 3 things, 5 things, 10 things. And we, as eyewitnesses, are here to tell you that we saw that with our own eyes in the person of Jesus Christ. And that's why Jesus commissions them as his eyewitnesses, as direct evidence. And they only replace the missing Judas, for example, with somebody named Matthias, who happens to be somebody who was part of the collection of people in the upper room who had seen Jesus from the baptism to the resurrection. That was the criteria. By the way, there could have been a lot of other criteria. They could have said it has to be a certain kind of character, has to have a certain kind of preaching skill. No. One criteria to replace Judas: has he been an eyewitness from the beginning to the end? If he qualified in that regard, he was available, and Matthias got chosen. So clearly, this entire approach has always been, from a Christian perspective, evidential. Now, we may be in a tradition, or we may have interpreted theological constructs that say, no, it's something else, but that's not the way it was presented in the New Testament, and this is not even the way that Jesus did it. Jesus was a strict evidentialist.
Yeah, I'm with you. Everything you've said, I don't think I disagree with anything you've just said.
Well, so part of this is about us deciding. So for me, I just thought, well, everyone becomes a Christian this way, right? I mean, I thought church is full of people, because I walked in that
I
first
wish.
day. It was so weird, right? I walked in, and only background Susie had was regular church mass attendance, which was for her probably maybe growing up was pretty frequent. But when we started dating, she was 15, I was 17. Really, we had no frequent attendance to anything. But on like holidays, Christmas, I was willing, as part of her family tradition, to go to a mass. Didn't think it was true, but I thought fine. But that was our only background coming into this. And when we first stepped foot in this evangelical church, it was kind of like a warehouse church, right? Like it was not in what you might think
traditional
of from a
church
Catholic
structure
perspective. Yeah, she walked in and she says, "Man, this does not feel holy," because her only context for this was the traditional cross structure of Catholic sanctuaries. And so she didn't really understand, like, this is church? And then they had a worship team that was like, a full-on band, right? And I was thinking at the time, this is bizarre. But after I became a Christian, I started looking around and I started thinking, so all these people must know now what I know. Nope, not true, as you know.
Yeah.
So it's something that I spent the last, 20 years trying to argue for. And you know this, if you write an apologetics book, you're only going to reach 10% of the church buying group. So Christians aren't even interested in apologetics books. This is one of the smallest niche markets And that's the trick, and that's why I think that I've tried to. And look for example at your Defenders conference. I'm looking at this website again. I know these guys, and I know what their books do. I know how popular their books are and aren't. And I look at those books, and there's a couple of guys there who have written some of the best books on this subject.
Yeah.
Yet I bet you if you compared their book sales to Jesus Calling, right? Forget about it. You compare their book sales to what Oprah Winfrey will do with a book.
Oh, yeah.
Forget about it. And a lot of this is just that we are in this. I said this to Sean McDowell this morning. We were having breakfast or having a coffee this morning. And I said, if you think about it, we are asking people to form a new kind of version of Christian living. But this version we're asking for is a more laborious version. In other words, it's really easy to discuss your Christian walk if all we're asking you to do is to share your testimony. Because everyone's got one and they're natural. Yeah. It's the story of their life. It's easy to say. But if you have to know something evidentially in order to share the truth, that's harder because you'd have to actually know something aside from your own personal experience, which requires no work at all. So we're asking people to live in a way that is more labor intensive. And that's why when people ask me I can't tell you, I do a lot of churches and a lot of conferences, and they're not always just the apologetics fans. There are sometimes just church attenders, which is great. And they'll always say, okay, during Q&A, this is all great. We've heard yours. Okay, great. But we want to know what's your testimony. They want to know how you became a Christian, just like you were talking when we started here. And I almost always will say, it doesn't matter how I became a Christian. I mean, I'll be happy to share it with you, but I think it's meaningless and unimportant. What matters is this true? Because people have, everyone in every stripe of every religious belief system, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Buddhists,
they have their own testimonies. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And those don't matter because you can have a rich, robust, amazing testimony that even seems supernatural, yet be in a system that's utterly false. So I just don't think that it's worth telling you what my testimony. I don't want you to get locked into that view of what it is to be a Christian. I'd much rather you look and see if it's evidentially true.
Yeah. Now, for you, when you went to pursue the facts, to pursue the history, to discover what was true, you came to the understanding that Christianity is a falsifiable religion. So what do we mean when we say that Christianity is falsifiable, and what makes that different from the other world religions like Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc.?
Yeah, because I thought that all of these systems, when I was an atheist, I thought that all of these systems were the same in the sense that you have to just take them on experience or take them on faith, because I thought that the word meant basically that you had no evidence, so therefore you just took it on faith. And so I thought that's why I wasn't interested. I don't think I could be part of something that is not falsifiable or verifiable, one or the other, and both actually. But what I mean by that is that unlike other systems, this system rises and falls on the truth nature of a claim about history. So Buddhism does not make historical claims about the past that I can cross-check, that I could even try to establish. But this system is all about whether or not Jesus rose from the grave. And it hinges entirely on that one episode, only because it makes an affirmative claim that Jesus rose from the grave. So if it's not true, this is built on a lie. And so this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So for me, that made it really easy, because when I hit that passage, I was like, okay, even he says, if I spend my time here as an investigator, it'll be well served, because this is what it all comes down to, is this hinge experience. And that's what I tried to do. I tried to stay in that lane and just look at this one issue. And I have a tendency to believe people who rise from the dead. So if I discovered he rose from the dead, I'm probably going to believe what he has to say about other things. And that would uniquely separate him from other religious leaders. When I was in high school, the closest I ever came to wanting to follow an ancient sage was I had a sociology teacher who was Baha'i and introduced me to the writings of Baha'u'llah. And I was so captivated by his story, being in prison and writing this entire manuscript in his own blood while he's in captivity. And his statements, his wisdom statements, are all a collection of proverbial truth claims. So they really would be great fortune cookies, right? I mean, they really are good Twitter posts because they're these short, pithy, provocative statements about reality that are self-contained and make no claims about history. There's no way to verify or falsify these things. I mean, you could say, well, that's pretty wise. That's a wise statement. That's true. But anyone can make that wise statement and still be a charlatan. You just don't, it's just a wise statement is all it is. And so I wondered if Jesus was in that same category, but he's not, because this is a claim about something that puts him in a different category. He's not like Baha'u'llah or Muhammad or Buddha or anyone. If in fact he's claiming he rose from the dead, he's either a fake, a liar, like the same old liar, lunatic Lord. I didn't know that paradigm, but I mean, it was clear to me that when someone makes a claim like that as an investigator and it's not true, then I'm done with you. And so this is how I felt about this claim. So I think that's what separates it, and why we ought to, if we have the one theistic worldview that is driven by a claim in history you could actually corroborate, then we ought to have a system in place to share this worldview that is uniquely Christian in the sense that it's driven by this process of corroboration. Because we could easily do what everyone else does, but that's what everybody else does. We have the one system you could actually work differently with, and I think we ought to take advantage of that.
Speaking of corroboration, your work as a crime scene detective has been able to allow you to see that the Gospels themselves are these reliable documents. And so you might think how, you might take interviews of witnesses that have seen a crime, and you might see how their stories corroborate, and that can help lead to the reliability of what they're saying actually happened. So how was it that, your skills here led you to discover that the Gospels were reliable?
Well, right away, as I read through these Gospels trying to get the wisdom statements of Jesus, I kind of thought it would be like reading the writings of Baha'u'llah. So I buy a Bible and I open it up and I start going through to see, what does Jesus say? What do the red letters say? What is it this pastor thinks is so brilliant? So I read through the Gospels and I discovered that they're really encased in what they appear to be claims about true events that actually happened in the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I thought, okay, learned a long time ago, you don't trust any eyewitnesses, even on any case. They can tell you something really cool, something that will help your case. They can say, oh yeah, I saw him do that. Don't trust it. I've been a fool many times when people early on in my career would tell me something that was untrue. So I always test it. And then if I test it and it passes the test, well, then I will trust him, because then I know that test could be applied in front of a jury and he'll still pass the test. My concern is I might trust somebody, but what if the DA, or the defense attorney rather, has a more rigorous approach to this guy and discovers something in his past, discovers some other, I don't need to find that out on the eve of his testimony. That's what I typically do, is they'll typically release that discovery to you on the eve of their testimony. And then I'm like stuck with this guy. So I want to do that myself before I get to trial. And that's what I tried to do with the Gospels. There's a criteria we use in criminal trials it's built on 13 or 14 questions that jurors can ask themselves when assessing eyewitnesses. They're in the California jury instruction, which I've got on my shelf back here. And so I just took those and said those 13 or 14 questions really break down into 4 large categories. So if I could test the Gospels in these 4 categories, were they really written early enough to contain eyewitness testimony at all? Because if they're not written early enough, then they don't contain you have to be there in order to say you were there. 2, can they be corroborated in some way? 3, have they changed their story over time, or have they been honest and accurate? 4, do they possess some bias that would cause them to lie? This is how we test eyewitnesses. And and I think part of the biggest problem, and I think actually, if you look at the experts you have at your conference, I mean, how do we develop expertise in something? You've got people who are either experts in philosophy, or they have great manuscript expertise, or they have great expertise in the history of the first century, or the history, in this case, of ancient times regarding Jewish culture. And that gives you a certain expertise. That's not who I am. It's not. But that's not who jurors are either. Jurors are not experts. They're just regular people. And they're people who are passionate It's why you try to pick people that care.
That care for the law and justice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That are smart enough. They want to serve. They want to be there. And you don't expect them to be experts in the area in which you're investigating. As a matter of fact, I will not allow experts on my jury. I may call experts, but you don't put experts on your jury because they sometimes are prideful and they hold a position. Like you got 4 experts here on this issue of and they all disagree with each other.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so what's going to happen is your attendees get to be the jury that, after listening to the 4 experts, will land this issue for themselves. That's what we do in criminal trials. And so I'm always concerned about, well, what do I bring to this? What I bring to this is I know how to put together cases. I know how to put together cases and make them clear for juries. So I listen to the experts. I don't always agree. I land it because I'm looking at every expert. I'm looking at all 4 of these guys, and I will tell you which one of these 4. I won't tell you. Your audience will have to tell you that next week. But I would say, look, based on what I would do, I think I could only land this in front of a jury one of these 4 ways. And this is the way I think that, because I know how to build cases in front of a jury, and I know which seems to be the most reasonable inference from the evidence that juries will accept. So that's what the expertise that I bring to this. And so that's what I try to do in my books. And when I just try to say, look, I get it. There's lots of views on this. There's lots of experts in manuscript evidence, lots of experts around the first century related to Israel or related to the context in which Jesus lived. But it turns out all these experts don't even agree with each other on most things. What I can help you do is see how to put the evidence case together and how to arrive at the most reasonable inference that you could actually throw to a jury. And so for me, that's what I tried to do. And one of those tool sets that I realized early on is that people will say that these differences between accounts have to be resolved in some way. How do we resolve the differences between the Gospels? And what I see a lot of people who have manuscript expertise who are wrestling with this and are willing to concede certain issues, to concede certain points of Scripture even, because they're trying to resolve the differences between the Gospels. And those people all have great expertise in history and in manuscript evidence, but they have never worked with eyewitnesses. They have never interviewed 3, 4, 5, 6 people who see the same event, and then they come to you within hours of seeing it, and they give you a story. They never line up. They never match. Yet I don't start sacrificing the details in order to arrive at the truth, because this is what reliable eyewitness testimony looks like. And the only thing I ever say to anybody when a dispatcher dispatches me to a homicide, I only have one request that I make, and that is, you've got officers at the scene, right? I'm going to be an hour before I get there. I got to put a suit on. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, so I'm going to be a little while getting there. So do me a favor, have your officers separate the eyewitnesses. That's the only instruction I offer. Because I know that if they don't separate those eyewitnesses, I'm going to get the same story 5 or 6 times. And I don't want the same story. I want it to be nuanced. I don't want them to talk to each other and try to resolve the alleged differences. Those differences, number one, are not really what you think they are. And they are built into a witness's geographic difference in the crime, also their personal histories, the things they're interested in. If I'm a gun nut, I'm probably going to get the gun details down. If I'm a clothing nut, I'm probably going to get the clothing details down. And I need to know enough. I'll be interviewing and asking those kinds of questions so I know who to trust on certain issues, who might see things more. Like, why would you just leave that detail out? I didn't even notice it. Well, how could you not notice that? That's not his interest. And so I need to figure out what are your interests so I can see why it is you wouldn't notice something. So a lot of these alleged discrepancies that I see a lot of theologians and academic people wrestle to try to figure out what is the overarching reason. And I'll just be honest, I'm not impressed with any of that, because I just know that the one thing I can help you with is what it looks like to interview eyewitnesses, because that's what I've been doing for a living for, 30 years. And it does teach you that there's a certain level of variation you should expect to see. I can't give it to you in numbers, but it's something you just start to get comfortable with. And then when I see it's outside that range, then I'm going to ask penetrating questions. But if I see it's under that range, I'm going to go, you guys been talking to each other, haven't you? So that's where I'm at.
So what you mean by variation is that the stories will be different from one
they're
person
going to be different. Oh my
to the
gosh,
next.
yes. Oh, absolutely. And there'll be some that will be so different that give me an example of this. So order matters. And the reason why we try to separate the eyewitnesses is we don't even want them next to each other when we finally interview them. So we're going to separate the eyewitnesses, and then we're going to keep these people separated, and we're going to talk to each one individually. I don't want the other people to hear what this guy says. But there are times when you just can't help it for whatever reason. You're now dealing with somebody who, for whatever reason, is aware of what the others said. Maybe he comes to you several days later, and he's talked to one of the other eyewitnesses, but he didn't want to stick around on the night of the murder. So now he's coming back in, but he knows what that one eyewitness has already said. Maybe somebody gets wind of it in the press, and they release certain details you don't want released, and then you find a witness come forward. This is really true on cold cases, because after a while we start releasing details. And then you got to deal with the guy who comes in 10 years later, and he's aware of what the original details are. So what happens is typically those kinds of witnesses will quickly just fill in the gaps. They already know you have the overarching story, and they will simply fill in gaps for you. Like they'll say, I want to clarify something that I think people have been telling you, and then they will clarify it. And you're like, well, look, okay, I get that, but just do me a favor, pretend like you don't know what they already told me, and please just start at the first and just walk me through what you saw. I don't want you to try to fill in gaps. We can do that later, but what I want right now is for you to start in the very beginning. And so you'll see that if there's somebody who comes in late who's aware of the prior testimony, you're going to have to do this. And so when I see that John, for example, has a different kind of gospel that includes elements of the synoptics, but really includes clarifications of details that are in the synoptics, I don't get nervous about that. It doesn't bother me because I see this all the time in eyewitness testimony. Unfortunately, nobody, is able to do what we do in criminal trials: separate people, keep them from knowing what they're talking about, and start at the beginning and work to the end.
Right.
That didn't happen with John, so I get that, but it doesn't mean I'm going to now wrestle and say, well, this is some unusual. I'm not going to go to extraordinary efforts.
Yeah.
To try to explain that, because that is so typical of it. You can just stay within the simplicity of eyewitness statements to explain this stuff.
And your intention here isn't per se to harmonize every difference in the gospel. Your intention here is to illustrate that these are reliable eyewitnesses to what, to the events surrounding Jesus' life.
So let me just say something that if you're not careful on how you parse it, and we've seen this recently where church leaders have been really making an effort to be persuasive, but because they're speaking every Sunday, they're not necessarily as precise. So you sacrifice some precision in order to be persuasive at times. You just do, and that's that. I've seen that happen in the last year or so with several people on the national level. Yeah. But what really? So I'm going to say something, and I'm going to clarify it quickly. So I think that my interest as an atheist was not about inerrancy. I wasn't in circles where that issue was coming up for me. I just bought a Bible for the first time. So I needed to know, is this reliable eyewitness testimony? I do believe in inerrancy, but I think we have to talk about what we mean by that, okay? And for me, though, as an investigator, it was coming out of atheism. The inerrancy is not the issue. Now, if you said, well, look, we believe that every word is spoken from what I believe we have are eyewitness accounts that were driven by the Holy Spirit, but that retain the kinds of let's put it this way. If God intended for us to get 4 accounts that we could test in such a way that we could determine that they're reliable, like other reliable eyewitness accounts, he achieved it because we have a system in place that we can use. And so you might say, well, why would he leave these variations? Because this is the nature of reliable. Do you really think if we had 4 accounts that were word for word identical, that we would have greater confidence in their reliability? I think we'd have less confidence in their reliability. So I don't think God would remove those kinds of differences. Yeah. I think that in the end, you might say, well, how do I harmonize these? There's always a way to harmonize them. I retweet on my Twitter account. I follow 750 or so Christian blogs, and I scan those every day, and I try to get the top 12, 15 articles. And there's a couple of people who will write about these discrepancies the alleged contradictions. They do a great job, and every single one of them, I don't always agree with the approach, but it's clear that these can be harmonized. And so the question becomes, well, yeah, if you think, well, this is a bit of a stretch, you have not worked my cases. You'd have a harder time, believe me, harmonizing my eyewitnesses. Yet we convicted these guys. And after we convicted some of them, they confessed to it. So although I had crazy, allegedly contradictory accounts, we were able to harmonize them without throwing anything out. And then we convicted these guys based on those accounts. And then they eventually confessed that, yes, I did it. So clearly, you can have eyewitness accounts that appear to be contradictory, yet you can know that something is true. So that to me was never, it never stalled me. It never became a problem for me. That was the one thing actually that led me to think, oh man, because I know when people lie, they line up their lies. And this to me looked like that principle we talk about of embarrassment. I've known some guys who would include embarrassing things in their lie. I have known guys who
in order to be perceived
as,
as...
because they want to be more persuasive with me. So it's not as though it's not possible for you, but it is one of those pieces. I always say this is death by 1,000 paper cuts. So it's not that this is the one thing that sold it for me. It's just one of hundreds of things that when I look at them together cumulatively, there's not, like people will say, what's the one thing that convinced you? There's not one thing that convinced me. There's never one thing that convinces me unless he confesses. It's always going to be on the strength of 100 things that I don't know how you could get to another reasonable inference because of the weight of these 100 things.
Yeah, the cumulative.
And that's where
argument.
I arrived with this is where I arrived with Christianity.
Nice. Jim, this has been great. We've got to take a short break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the skills that you've applied and how Christians can apply those in their pursuit of truth and sort of some of the questions we should be asking ourselves. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you want to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can visit our website at veracityhill.com and click on that Patron tab. If you notice something different about our video during this half of the program, you'll see I forgot to turn on our screen here today, but check that out. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as well. And if you want to text the word Veracity to 555-888, you will get free text updates about our show, upcoming guests. You can even reply back if you have a guest you want on the show or a topic you want addressed. We'd be happy to take that input. Also, for our patrons, those are folks that just chip in a couple bucks a month, $5, $10, maybe $20. We've got a Marco Polo group on the Marco Polo app. It's a video walkie-talkie app. And I've had a great time interacting with some of the supporters who have asked questions or they've wanted me to ask questions of our guests. And that's just a great way for me to engage with some of the listeners. And, of course, we'd love to get your support. So you can go to veracityhill.com to learn more about that. On today's program, we're talking with cold case detective J. Warner Wallace. And he was an atheist growing up and in his 30s began to evaluate the truth claims of Christianity and came to realize, gee, what we have with the Gospels are reliable, eyewitness documents, and so they're worthy of our attention and support. And he became a Christian, and now he speaks nationwide. He's, I guess, an international speaker as well. He's written a number of different books: Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and Forensic Faith. And so we're talking about here the Gospels and how Jim has incorporated his detective skills, and he's going to be sharing with us some tips as well about how we can incorporate some of these tips when we're seeking truth. Now, Jim, I didn't tell you about this next segment of our program, and that's intentional. It's called Rapid Questions, where we ask just quick...
I can slow your questions down, young man, by just giving you really slow, laborious answers. So do I have a limit, or do you have a little dinger you can stop me?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, we have a game clock. It's a 60-second game clock.
Okay. All right, got it.
Yeah. So
it has to be, the answer has to be in 60 seconds? Is that what it is?
Well, we try to see how many questions you can answer within 60 seconds.
Okay, all right, let's do it.
All
I'm
right,
ready.
So I'll start the game clock. You won't hear it, but everyone else will. So it'll start when I ask my first question.
Dang.
Here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Men's Warehouse.
Taco Bell or KFC?
Oh my gosh. No, Taco Bell.
What song is playing on your radio these days?
Oh, it's something probably from David Nail.
Favorite sport?
Football.
What kind of razor do you use?
Gillette, of course. Mach 3.
What's
Come
your
on.
spouse's favorite holiday?
Oh, favorite holiday? Probably Christmas.
What's your most hated sports franchise?
Oh, most hated sports franchise. That's well, it used to be Cleveland, but now LeBron's here in the Lakers. What am I going to do now?
What's your favorite movie?
Favorite movie? Probably. The most recent favorite movie is a Silent Place, I think it's called.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
No, not really.
I'm sorry. Pick a fictional character you'd like to meet.
A fictional character. Oh man, what does Chris Pratt play on Guardians of the Galaxy? Oh, that character. I wouldn't mind meeting that character.
Nice. And the buzzer has gone off, but I've got one question I must ask you.
Yes, go.
Which celebrity are you most like?
Oh man.
How about which celebrity do you look most like?
Oh, the guy from Mad Men.
The guy from Mad Men. Chris, load it up. We've got it right here on the screen.
Time. Are you kidding me? I get that all the time. Or I get Anderson Cooper. I get that a lot.
Oh,
too.
okay. I can see Anderson Cooper. But what's the celebrity's name, Chris?
I forget his name.
What is it?
Latterney.
I think so. I know him as Howard Stark from the Marvel movies. He's one of the actors that plays Howard Stark.
Is he? Okay, you know what? I don't even know that. I didn't even know that. Okay, so yeah, that's the guy that everyone thinks I look like.
Yeah. We've got it up here for those watching the video online.
There you go. And you can see he's a much better looking guy, so that's what we do. So I guess it's a compliment. I mean, I'm happy to be mistaken for him then.
Yeah. Okay, so most hated sports franchise was the Cavaliers, and
yes.
So now that has changed to...
Well, you know what's interesting about that is that it's not. I mean, I just...
You're being playful, yeah.
Well, they were rivals for all those years from this West Coast team that all of us love, right? The Warriors. That's really the only reason. And we're happy to have LeBron at the Lakers.
Yeah.
Because now we have it's not really about. It's interesting about basketball. Basketball is not like other sports. Basketball is all about heroes and villains, whereas the other sports are like more team kind of sports. And so there are people you just like or don't like, and that becomes the thing. So
basketball used to be a team sport.
I know, but it's now about personalities. And so
it is.
I do like LeBron. So I just hated the fact that franchise was always given the Warriors a run for its money. So I guess basically I am a Warriors fan. I'll just say that now. So anyone who steals a player from the Warriors or it gives us a difficulty in the playoffs, for that year anyway, that's the franchise I hate.
Yeah, right.
Like Houston was the Rockets. I mean, they came within a whisper last season. The seventh game.
Yeah.
Like, dude, I hate that franchise.
So our actor's name is John Slattery.
John Slattery is the celebrity.
Okay. Well, see, he should change his name because it's really a hard name to say. Right? But I guess you don't have to if you're famous.
J. Warner Wallace. That's easy. That just rolls off.
That's also hard to say. Too many W's, I think.
But do you know how many people they can't even say my last name? So Jairus.
That's why, because they want to try to either put a Y instead of the J. They think they can help you with that, right?
Yep, we get that.
Well, I changed my name because of Greg Kokel, I was doing radio with him, and I would either sit in for him or be a guest, and people would say, "Oh, you're going to have Jim Wallace on your show next week. You must be a pretty open-minded guy because Jim Wallace doesn't seem like he holds any of your positions." Because they were thinking about Jim Wallace from Sojourners in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So he said, "Dude, if you're going to be on my show, you're going to have to change your name." And I'm like, well, my search warrants all say J. Warner Wallace because my grandfather's Warner. And so I said, we'll just use that one. And that kind of stuck, and that's why I use that name when I write, just to avoid confusion.
Okay, so in the first half of the program, we talked a little bit about your background and the importance that evidence and eyewitness testimony played into your journey and your confirmation too. I mean, for you, it's about the facts. You want to know what the truth is.
Right.
So what are some of those skills that you would advise Christians to utilize in their own pursuits of truth?
Well, okay, you guys have had great, I'm looking at all your podcasts. You've had some great people on. You had Craig Evans. You had some great people on your podcast who kind of talked about how we could test the reliability of Scripture, right? And I'm guessing that these are some principles, like the principle of embarrassment. Those kinds of things are usually what we talk about. So let me just give you some different principles that maybe you haven't heard in the last few months or weeks on the podcast that might help you. And they're really 30,000 feet principles. They're overarching large principles. So these might look at this and go, really? Like that's going to help? But actually it will, especially if you're trying to communicate what you believe is true, what is true about God or Christianity to others. A couple of things these are just jury instructions we give jurors. They help us. And you do not just pick a jury. You pick a jury and then you instruct the jury. And then they can assess the evidence. But they don't just assess this blindly. We actually give them some guidelines, some structure. And one of the simple things we talk about is the difference between possible and reasonable. And this will help you because people think they have to be beyond a possible doubt before they can accept anything. And that's not true for anything they believe. No one believes anything beyond a possible doubt. Our own existence, you could say, well, I could raise a possible or imaginary doubt about anything you think you know with certainty. Now, the question, of course, is my complaint, is my objection, is the issue I'm raising reasonable? And that's why the standard of proof is not that high at possible doubt. It's lower at reasonable doubt. And there's a difference between possible. We have a jury instruction for this where we tell people to remember that I can raise an imaginary or possible doubt about anything. So that's not our standard. We would never convict anybody if that was the case. And this is true, for example, we're going to get out of this podcast today, and at some point we're going to go back to our cars, put our key in the ignition and turn the car, and that car could explode in your face on the driveway because that happens every day in America or in the world somewhere. And so it's not just, it's possible.
It could be you.
Yeah, it could be you today. And it's not going to, but we don't operate on what's possible because we'd be paralyzed by that high standard. Instead, we operate on what's reasonable. And that is important for us to remember. And what that means is that you're going to have to make a decision about something with a lot of unanswered questions. And that's another jury instruction we give jurors, is that we can't answer every question for you. And I've had cases where what you might think are the most important questions were unanswerable. Where's her body? Well, we never recovered her body. We don't know where her body was buried. We don't know how he killed her. We don't know where he killed her. We don't know where he put her body. We don't know how he moved her objects in her car so it looked like she ran off. We couldn't answer any of those questions. Yet the jury came to a verdict within 4 hours because you can know that he did it without having to know how, why, or where he did it. And so these were large unanswered questions. It turns out all of us believe things for which we still hold large unanswered questions, yet we still believe this to be true, whatever this is. And so if you think I've got to remove all questions that could be asked about Christianity or about God's existence in order to believe that he exists or that Christianity is true, well, you were holding a standard for this claim that you don't hold for any other claim, because we certainly tell jurors all the time, if you cannot go into the jury room and say, well, I still have open questions. Okay, duh. You're going to have open questions. That's just the nature of this work. And that cannot paralyze you. And so that's something that I think helps when talking to people about this claim. The third thing is that all of us share a burden of proof. I think that the argument is sometimes made that you Christians believe that there is a God that I can't see. And so that means you have a burden. You're making an affirmative claim for something. Therefore, the burden is yours to prove your claim. And I have no burden. I'm not making the claim that God exists. Well, of course, that's not what happens at crime scenes. Okay, what happens at crime scenes is we get to a crime scene and we look at the stuff in the crime scene and we say, "Wow, there's like 10 pieces of evidence here." And my partner is going to say something. He's going to pop off and go, "Dude, this dude's husband killed her." And I might look at that same set of evidences and say, "I don't think so. I think the evidence in this scene points to her sister." Now, he's got a claim about a cause. He thinks it's the husband. I've got a claim about a cause. I think it's the sister. I have a burden to show to him, my team first, and eventually to a jury, why the sister is the best inference from evidence. He's going to have a burden to show why he thinks the husband is the best inference from evidence. Okay, we're at the scene of the crime, the universe, and we're looking in the universe, and we see features of the universe that have to be explained. I'm going to make a claim. I think God, a cause outside of space, time, and matter, is the best explanation for the things we see inside of space, time, and matter. I have a burden to show you why I think my causal explanation is the best inference from evidence. But if you're telling me you think you can get those same things with just nothing more than space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, you have a burden to show me how space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can get those 8 things. We both share a burden. So that's why we have to at least put that burden back on those who are asking us to be the one to make the case.
Jim, your Skype kind of paused there and then caught up quickly. Could you repeat the last couple sentences there?
Yeah, so I think that we each have a causal burden. If we think that if somebody, for years, I thought that I could get everything in the universe from a purely naturalistic perspective, nothing more than space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. And if that is my claim, that I can get that stuff and I don't need God for it, then I have a burden to explain how space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can get that stuff.
Yeah, great.
So we each hold a equal burden because we're each offering a different causal suspect.
So when we're looking at the Gospels, what are some of the questions we should be asking to determine whether they are in fact reliable?
I think it comes down if we think these are telling us something that occurred in history that's been reported by people who allegedly were there. So if Matthew and John are really eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus, if Luke allegedly has access to those eyewitnesses during his time traveling with Paul, and he would have had access to them, and he seems to make that claim in Luke 1, if Papias is correct in arguing as an early bishop of the church that Mark wrote his account at the feet of the eyewitness named Peter, well, then we can test these using eyewitness tools. And it's going to come down to those 4 things. Are they early enough to have been present so that we really are looking? Because look, if you're going to lie about Jesus, here's the way you do it. You wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead, because then you can say anything you want about Jesus, and who's going to know if you're lying? So you wait and write the story in the 2nd generation, 3rd generation after Jesus' life. So if they are eyewitness accounts, that means they would have to be written by eyewitnesses, and that helps us because number one, it's early enough to kind of check the first box, and it would be early enough that if somebody caught a lie, they would be able to call them out and say, that's not true. I knew Jesus. He was none of those things. So that's what first criteria. How early are they? Early dating of the Gospels will go a long way toward helping us answer the question. 2, can they be corroborated in some way? We will use evidence, physical evidence, to corroborate an eyewitness's claims. We can use another eyewitness. We can use any number of things to corroborate an eyewitness. But whatever we use, it'll only be touch point. So, for example, if a witness says, yeah, he leaned over the counter, he stuck a gun in her face, and he said, give me all the money. And that's the claim of the eyewitness. Well, if I go back and I find his palm print on the counter exactly where this witness said that he leaned over to make this claim, that's going to help corroborate the claim. But the palm print will tell me nothing about what he was wearing, what he said, or if he had a gun. So it turns out that any corroborative evidence you use in a case is just a small fraction. Like, I wish I had video of every crime. I don't. So I have to look at small pieces of corroborative evidence that support the larger story. This is the nature of corroborative evidence. So I'm looking for something similar in the Gospels. I don't expect to have a video.
So
I'm expecting small pieces of corroborative evidence.
To make that connection then for corroboration, for me, Luke, the author Luke, as a historian, he talks about historical politicians, places, structures at these places.
Yep.
These then would fall under this category of the corroboration there.
And so you might feel like, okay, so fine. He's got small pieces of corroboration, but you could also use the earliest commenters, the people who are writing about Christianity. I would only stay in the first century or close to the first century, try to stay within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. I would not look at things, that we sometimes will pull in the writings of other authors. I would leave those later ones out. But that'll give you some small glimpses of what corroborates. You could also look at internal evidences in the Gospels themselves. So there's a number. And I think that if you're only going to get touch point corroboration, then you need to be able to build a cumulative package of touch point corroboration. And I think that's very easy to do for the Gospels. And that's what I tried to do in the book. But that's the second thing. The third thing is, how do we know that even if it's an early account related to the life of Jesus, we know it's written early enough to have been written by an eyewitness and to have been written within the lifetime of those who would know better. That doesn't mean it's true, because you might have a version back then that was very different than the version you have now. If that first version is just a simple Jesus who was a rabbi, preaching rabbi who spoke some sermons but didn't do all the miraculous stuff, if that stuff's all added later, well, how do we know if that stuff was there in the beginning? And that's where we talk about a chain of custody, because what we do in criminal trials is we ask whoever collected that evidence at the crime scene, that first collector is going to write a report about collecting that evidence, and then he's going to give it to somebody else. And that second person in the chain is going to write a report about what he received. So did that shell casing, does it look the same in the second report as it did in the first? And then he's going to bring it to the crime lab, and that better match the first two reports. And then he's going to bring it to someone like me. I'm going to take it out and bring it in a trial. My reports need to match. So I've now got report after report after report over time, a chain of custody. Who touched it? What did they say about it? Well, you can do the same thing in the New Testament. You can look at the eyewitnesses, someone like John. You can say, well, who did John give his report to? He's got 3 personal students, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias. Well, what do their reports say? Well, we have those letters that they wrote to local congregations. Let's see if their story about Jesus matches John's. They've got a student, 2 of them, taught Irenaeus. We can see if Irenaeus' story matches Ignatius and Polycarp and doesn't match John. So we can do the same thing with this report. You're going to be stuck with, this is why I think it's silly to argue that somehow the Jesus of Nazareth became the Christ of Christianity. It's going to be silly to do that, because the chain of custody shows us that this is an early account and it never changes. Doesn't mean it's true, but at least you got to admit that. And so I do think the most reasonable inference is that it's and then finally the issue of bias, right? Look, I when I first became interested in Christianity, I was also simultaneously interested in Mormonism, because I had so many Mormons in my family. That was the one group of believers, all atheists, except I do have 6 brothers and sisters, all raised LDS. So I was interested in the claims of Joseph Smith on this one issue of bias. The problem you're going to have is that there's only 3 reasons why anyone tells a lie. The same 3 reasons why you commit a murder or do a theft or do anything you shouldn't do. It comes down to financial greed, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power. There's no 4th category. I had someone write me this morning, what about someone who just wants prestige or fame? Well, that's in the 3rd category. It's power, authority, respect, fame, or saving face is power. So there is no 4th category. Jealousy is not a 4th category. Why are you jealous? It's in one of the first 3. Vengeance is not a 4th category. It's one of the first 3 is why you want revenge. So this makes it easy for us to assess liars, because I'm looking at those 3 areas. Joseph Smith had motive in all 3 of those areas to lie about the Book of Mormon. He was being supported financially by his church. He consistently tapped into the money of his followers to buy things. He started a bank with the money of his followers. He also had more than 30 wives that were written into the system in Doctrines and Covenants. He saw this was a prophecy that he wrote in to make sure he could do this. He also, at one point, was running. He claimed he announced his running for the presidency. He was in charge of the largest standing army on the North American continent, aside from the American militia. So power was an issue. Does not mean Joseph's lying, but it means he had motive to lie. What I have a hard time with is trying to figure out why any one person, let alone hundreds of people, because that's the claim here. Remember, it's not just the 12 disciples. It's 120 in the upper room. It's 500 that Paul says were still alive for the Corinthians to ask questions. So there's a lot of people here who are making this false claim. What is motivating them? Is it money, sex, or power? Those are the only things that motivate any of us to lie. I think you're going to have a hard time arguing that they're motivated by these three things. And so I think when you look at that entire cumulative case of, are they early enough? Have they changed over time? Can they be corroborated? And are they driven by a motive that would cause people to lie? I became relatively comfortable that this was a reliable account. And then you're stuck with this dude who came out of the grave. So then what do you do with that? You have to do something with him.
Yeah, good. Speaking of what to do with him, so scholars, they're different hypotheses and different about the events of early Christianity. What are some of those different perspectives on, the events surrounding Jesus' life and ministry?
So when you say different perspectives, you mean in terms of the transmission of the documents or in terms of the actual claims? There's a couple ways of looking at this.
Yeah, I think I have in mind here specifically with regard to the resurrection. So Christians believe Jesus physically rose from the dead.
Right.
People have other perspectives, like there was the twin theory was thrown out in a debate against William Lane Craig. And so what are some of those theories out there?
Yeah. So there's a lot of this and so remember, imagine yourself as a detective in a courtroom where your defense attorney is offering one of these alternatives. I mean, you're going to have to assess this alternative evidentially in front of your jury. And so that kind of helps you to think about how, just to get real practical, because what happens sometimes is we think about this as a 2,000-year-old event that's in Scripture, and we kind of lose we kind of forget that you could actually approach this in a very nonsensical way as a detective. So there's lots of different theories. I think there's probably 6 that I would have held or embraced or championed as an atheist. And then, of course, there's the Christian perspective, that this is just as reliable. This is what actually happened. But the non-Christian perspectives are pretty numerous, right? Because you could be a result of a lie, a conspiracy told by the people who wanted to advance a cause. It could be that they imagined this in some way. Either it's an hallucination, or it could be, for example, that an imposter sat in and did this, pretending to be Jesus, either on the front side to the cross or on the back side after the cross.
Yep.
It could be that, there's a number of ways of looking at this, right? So I made a list of all 6 ways. And by the way, this is not uncommon. I talk about this in the book. We have to do something similar when we look at death scenes, because not every death scene is a crime scene. There are 4 ways to die, and so we will write out the 4 ways to die: accidental, natural, suicide, homicide. And then you look at all the evidence in the room and you try to figure out which of those 4 ways is the most reasonable inference given the evidence in the room. Okay, let's make a list of all the evidence we have you can argue about whether or not this is good evidence, but we do seem to have a claim that's pretty early in history that involves an empty tomb that, by the way, I think was empty, because the easiest way to stop this quickly is to provide the body of Jesus. Over, done. Or get the eyewitnesses to recant. Those 2 things would end it. So I think you can make a list of what you think our evidence is that we have to explain. And by the way, every one of these other explanations does that. It tries to explain what they think they have to explain because they got a problem, they don't agree with it. So I made a list of all those things. 7 ways to explain the resurrection. The problem is that none of them work. And that's why we have 7, because they realize they don't work. And so they always provide an alternative, because, hey, did they lie? Well, if you know anything about how conspiracies are built, you'll quickly find out, okay, maybe he just didn't die. Maybe he just was badly injured. He just looked bad. He was unconscious but not dead. Well, do you know anything about death? If you know something about death, so I kind of walk through all of these. And I did this myself as a new investigator of this claim, because I would have embraced one of those 6. I would have been happy to do that. They don't work, though. Now, I would have said, well, your Christian explanation doesn't work either, because your Christian explanation requires a supernatural event called the resurrection, and we know that's garbage. So there's no way I can embrace that. But remember, That is only garbage because I held a view that disallowed anything supernatural, disallowed anything miraculous. And the reason why I held that view is because I held that view. It was based really on my bias against the supernatural. Look, you could argue, well, I've never seen, anything like that. That should not. We work in physics all the time, exploring areas that we will not see in our lifetime, and we develop theories to explain the unseen, the things we'll never experience. So I don't know that should disqualify it. The issue comes down to, of all the explanations, the only thing that made the Christian explanation unacceptable, it turns out, was my bias against the Christian explanation. If I could be neutral, well, then clearly the other things don't work, and I take great pains to kind of go through why they don't work. But then I'm left with a straightforward explanation. It just happened. And the only thing I have to overcome is my bias against the supernatural. That seemed to me to be an easier jump. Remember, everyone believes something for which they have less than perfect evidence, less than complete evidence. If you're an atheist, you believe something and you can't explain several features of the universe, and your explanation is probably going to be something like, well, yes, but someday we'll be able to explain those because we'll figure out a theory to explain those. But right now, we can't explain those things. You can't explain the information in DNA. You can't explain the fine-tuning in the universe without going to a theory like multiverse theory, which is a much bigger jump for me than the God hypothesis.
And just begs the question, too. I mean,
I think it's only a construct that helps you get over the problem to begin with, rather than is driven. It's not like you didn't know about the fine-tuning of the universe, but some other cause led you to believe there's a multiverse. It was the fine-tuning of the universe that was the tail that wagged that dog from the beginning. So I mean, that's a problem, I think. So
if there
I just got to that place where I thought that was the most reasonable explanation.
So if there were one weakness to the resurrection hypothesis, that would be it, that it requires the supernatural. And that was a jump that you had to make. So,
yeah, because like a lot of us who are not believers, we would say, hey, if you're going to include supernatural explanations, you're not doing history and you're not doing science, because those things have to. So here's how I put it: if you're investigating a crime scene, you're doing the same thing, asking questions that we were asked when we were kids. Our English teacher would say, write a paper, and I want you to answer these questions: who, what, where, why, when, how. Well, I can tell you what we do in investigations. If I made a list of how and where and why and when and what happened, I will never take anyone to jail, because the how, what, where, when, those things don't answer the biggest question I need to answer, which is a who question. Who did it? The who question is what brings people into custody. Okay? Now, science is willing to ask the other questions, but they will never ask the who question. Now, we know in order to do an investigation completely, you have to ask all the questions. What happened? When did it happen? Why did it happen? Where, and who did it? And if we're not going to ask that, if you think, no, there are no who questions, only what questions, what set of impersonal forces is behind this, you're leaving out the most important question, the classic questions we ask in any investigation, and you're only leaving that question out because you refuse to ask it. Now, for years, science asked who questions. But after the Enlightenment, we decided that who questions were out of the question. And we've eliminated who. I think you can still do science with the same kinds of revolutionary advances. All you're doing is slipping. I'm not going to default everything to a who. Sometimes the best answer is a what. But if everything points to minds who act freely and are the source of information in DNA, I don't know why I would reject the most reasonable inference if it seems to me that the who question will get it done. And so I think we should just leave that question on the table. And that's what I was unwilling to do as an atheist when examining any event in history or any event in science. I just rejected who questions.
So given the evidence that we have available to us, and when we talk about the best explanation and whatnot, why do some people still reject that conclusion?
So there's a difference between facts and inferences. And so I spend many weeks in a criminal trial presenting the facts during the evidence show. But then in the closing argument, I'm going to argue for what the best inference is from those facts. So I see people confusing this. They'll say the fact of evolution. Evolution, if it's true, it still wouldn't be a fact. It's an inference from facts. It may be a true inference. I'm not going to argue that right now. But stop calling it a fact, because that's not how this works. We present facts in the trial, and then we ask a jury to make an inference. There's two different things. And the problem is that between the facts and the inferences, I wish all it was the rules of evidence, this very kind of computer thing you pump in, and the computer takes all the rules and does a statistical analysis and it pushes it back out. But humans aren't computers, and we make inferences and we allow other things into that process, like desires and personal histories and hopes and aspirations and matters of the will, matters of the heart. These things are part of our inference making process. And those, unfortunately, are things that sometimes will be more dominant in our thinking than just the rules of evidence and where should this lead. And so I think what happens is we often will hear people say that they have rational objections, when in fact their real trouble might be in an emotional or volitional objection that's unstated. And I don't want to say this, it's hard to say that, because then atheists will listen to that and say, you're telling me that I don't have good reason to reject this, it's just my will or my emotion that's at work? No, I'm not saying that. But I think that none of us are going to express our volitional resistance or our emotional resistance to strangers. We're more than likely going to express it in the form of rational. I've got several things that bother me. Well, yeah, I get it. Those are standing between the facts and the inference. But if you just try to be neutral and allow the rules of evidence that's why a lot of time I spend with people is talking about the rules of evidence, because we're trying to help jurors to be unemotional. And we know that every juror's got a bias, got an opinion, got a perspective they come from. And we say, can you suspend those things in order to deal with this? Because you might have had a bad experience with somebody who's a redhead, but my suspect's a redhead. Are you going to be able to take your bad experience with redheads and not hold it against my suspect? And they'll say, yeah, of course. And then the defense attorney's got to decide, do I trust that this guy really can do that? And if he thinks he can, he'll leave him on the jury. So that's what we do, right? And so the same thing is happening here, is that at some point we have to ask ourselves, are you rejecting this because there's not enough evidence for this, or are you rejecting it because you don't want there to be enough evidence for this? And that just be honest about that. At the same time, I have to ask myself, am I embracing this because I think there's enough evidence for this, or am I embracing this because I really want it to be true and this is close enough? So that's something we have to also do as believers.
Yeah. Jim, this has been great. We're going to put up links to your books, Cold Case Christianity, and even with the Cold Case set, you've got sort of a discipleship small group series here. Let's see, we've got it up here.
Forensic Faith Forensic Faith has been. We just finished though Cold Case Christianity video curriculum. It releases October 1.
Yeah.
So that's coming out next month, and I just finished filming the God's Crime Scene curriculum. That'll come out next year. So what our hope is, we've got 3 adult books that make the case for Christianity, the case for God's existence, and the case for making the case, which unfortunately we have to do sometimes. Then we have 3 kids books that do the same thing for your kids at the Kids Academy, and now we'll have 3 sets of curriculum you can use in a small group setting. That's the hope.
Awesome. So we'll put links to all that stuff on our website. Let me ask you a final question. What's the next book, if any, coming from your pen or your computer, I guess?
Yep. I will tell you that Sean McDowell and I are working on a book that will help people who love young people, Gen Z, this next generation of high schoolers.
Yeah.
If you have those in your family, or you're a youth pastor or you've got those in your grandkids, or you just get it that the church has to be focused on this generation above all else, we're writing a book called So the Next Generation Will Know. And this is a book that just gives you practical strategies given on what we see and know is true about Gen Z, practical strategies to reach the next generation with a Christian worldview.
Nice. Maybe we'll have to coordinate both of you guys on our program. That would be stellar.
Be awesome. That would be awesome.
Cool. Thanks, Jim. Again, you're doing excellent work. Keep it up, and God's best to all that you're doing.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate you.
All right. God bless you. All right, well, that does it for our program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and nonprofit Megaphone. Thank you to our technical producer, Chris, and to our guest today, J. Warner Wallace, the cold case detective. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.